Hello there everybody, Sam's Trains here, welcome back to the railway and welcome to another Victorian running session. So, you might remember 1 or 2 weeks ago now, or quite a few weeks ago, I did a running session all about Victorian tank engines, and I have to admit I absolutely loved it. There is just something about Victorian steam locomotives in general which I absolutely love. So I enjoyed it so much that I've found another excuse to do another Victorian running session, this time of course with tender engines and not tank engines. Now there's something, again, quite special about Victorian tender engines. There's just something about that Victorian elegance that they all seem to have, and even the grubbiest of the Victorian freight steam locos seem to have that elegance to them. Victorian tender engines, and tank engines too I suppose, are also fascinating things because the Victorian era was of course where steam transitioned from its infancy into the giant that it eventually became, and it basically went on to conquer the transport industry and completely change the world of transport. And it's the Victorian era where that really happened, isn't it? That's where they really grew in terms of their size and power and speed, and it's interesting to see that growth. So I've filled the sidings again, you might be able to see some of that behind me. I've gotten all the Victorian tender engines I believe I have. If I've missed some, you'll have to let me know down in the comments, but fingers crossed I managed to get them all. I'm going to start and I'm going to show you all of them, and hopefully you enjoy it. There's nothing more to say, so let's get to it, shall we? So here we are at the sidings then, and I thought that this time I would start over at this end. No particular reason, just makes a bit of a change really. And today I have ordered the locos, but not in terms of their date or their railways or anything like that. I've ordered them this time in terms of the wheel configuration, because you might notice that the vast majority of them are a certain wheel configuration. And that's what we're starting with. We are starting with 060s, and I didn't realise this really, I'd never really thought about it, but it seems that most of the Victorian tender engines were in fact 060s, which I find really sort of interesting. So, starting off then, J36 Maud, of course, with the beautiful NBR livery. Absolutely love that one, so had to start with that. Of course, that is in Victorian condition. Unlike the next one, which is a J15, obviously that didn't start life on the LNER. I can't remember now where it did actually start. But it was built in the Victorian times, but obviously this model depicts it in later years, post-grouping of course, but still a Victorian design nonetheless. Then moving on, we've got a few from the LMS, and I have grouped these together, so the next three are actually, I believe, part of the same class. So this first one here is the Bachmann one. These are the Dealey/Johnson 3Fs from the Midland Railway. Obviously this first one is in the LMS. I believe the second two might be in the Midland livery, as you can see, they're the Triang ones. And yes, as you can see, all 060s, and 060s incidentally, I do have a bit of a theory as to why they might all be 060s. I think it just comes from a time where steam locos were reasonably small and reasonably slow, and also reasonably undeveloped, I suppose, for some of these. And it wasn't until they started to get larger and faster, obviously, that they actually started to need the extra stability that those ponies and bogies would bring when added to the front and back. And so yeah, I suppose that's why most of them are 060s, but they're not all 060s. But there we go, hopefully my little ramble there has given you a chance to properly look at these Dealey/Johnson 3F locomotives. And then moving on, we have yet a couple more from the Southern Railway. Again, two of the same class, but I didn't want to just put one out because they're both so lovely. So these are the SECR C-class, obviously, but neither of these are in SECR condition. So once again, it's just the design really that dates back to the Victorian times. I believe these might not have even been built during the Victorian times, because these were introduced in 1901, I believe. Then at the back, yet another Southern Railway 060, getting quite a few of these today. It is a Drummond design. It is the 700 class, I believe. Absolutely beautiful 060. Very, very Victorian looking, that one. But not as Victorian looking as the next one. Look at this thing. This is the Dean Goods. I think you'll have seen this before if you've been following my channel. Probably the most beautiful we've seen so far in terms of livery, possibly with the exception of the J36 that we saw at the start. But yeah, the beautiful Oxford Rail Dean Goods. Potentially not a very accurate model from what I've heard, but a beautiful model nonetheless. And that sums it up for the 060s. So as you can see, yes, quite a lot of them. Yes, quite a lot. Okay, so now we're going on to the second most popular wheel configuration from the Victorian era, at least in my collection. And it is the 440. So here are the first two here. We have the very lovely D16s. Now, once again, these are only just Victorian. I think these were introduced right at the end of Queen Victoria's reign, but still early enough to actually be, I think, considered Victorian steam locos. So we have the L&ER black version at the back there, 8802. Of course, once again, these two locos are not in their Victorian condition. This is post-grouping again. But the one on the right here, that is Claude Hamilton. That was the first built, and I believe that one certainly will have been built in the Victorian times in real life. So a gorgeous class of 440s, and I think the largest 440s as well of the day. Okay, next up, definitely more of a Victorian design. This one, I think these were from the 1880s or something like that. It's another Drummond design, this time the T9, absolutely classic. So, actually the one at the front here is the oldest modelled version. Once again, these were from the LSWR, and these are in southern liveries. So, once again, yes, not modelled from the Victorian era. I would love to get one in the LSWR green, incidentally. But still, nonetheless, designed and built in the Victorian times. We have the Southern Railway black at the front there, and then the British Railways green at the back, although quite clearly that's still in the southern colours, so that must have been just after nationalisation, where they wanted the tenders to read British Railways and things, but they didn't necessarily have the time, or I guess money, to actually paint them up. But yes, no doubt it would have eventually been repainted over the next few years. So that's it for the 440s, quite a few of those, and now we're getting on to probably my favourite wheel configuration from the Victorian era. It is, of course, the single wheeler, or the 422 wheel configuration. Now, we're starting off with Lord of the Isles here, and as you can see, this thing is really, really weird. In fact, the size of the driving wheels is quite incredible. So if you think about what that meant, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because obviously a driving wheel that size would mean not an awful lot of torque and not an awful lot of pulling power, really, because obviously there's only two wheels on one coupled axle. But what it would mean is that speed, incredible speed, would be able to be squeezed out of these, which in the Victorian times was quite important, because obviously railways really, for many people, still had to prove themselves. And so to have such a beautiful machine such as this, powering along at quite high speeds for the time, would have meant that steam would win a lot of people's hearts. So yes, I can't imagine how practical these would have been, but certainly fast. And obviously there was a single wheeler that ran the Flying Scotsman, which of course was famed for its speed, and that was of course the Stirling Single, was it? I think it was. Okay, so that's Lord of the Isles, that one. Ooh, what's that one? That's a Dean Single, isn't it, I think? Now we have yet another Drummond design. Drummond was certainly very prolific in the Victorian times. This is the Caledonian Single wheeler. Now, you can see two of them here, but they are in fact both the same engine. It was only ever one built. So the one of the back is in original condition. This is how it would have looked for the bulk of the Victorian times, I would have thought, in this beautiful Caledonian Railway blue. Once again, same sort of design, massive, massive single wheel. Well, not just one wheel, obviously. There's two driving wheels, but we call them single wheelers for whatever reason. So yeah, that's in the original condition. And then the one on the right-hand side, the red one there, is the same loco, but just from a snapshot of history a little bit later on. Post-grouping, when it became an LMS loco, so that's very nice, and we'll definitely get one of those running, I reckon, later on. And that's it for the single wheelers. If I just come around the beam, you can see we have yet another interesting wheel configuration. This is the only one I could find of this type. It is the 080, and that sort of, once again, goes back to what I was saying earlier on. Obviously, they hadn't really considered, or perhaps they had considered it because there were 440s and others, but they didn't seem to like adding bogies and front trucks and things to these locos for stability. So yeah, you get this weird sort of unbalanced look, don't you? Which I think really died with the Victorian era, with the exception of the Q6. I think that was post-Victorian, wasn't it? But yeah, certainly, you know, post-grouping, for example, post-1920s, you didn't tend to see locos like this. If they were going to have 8 coupled wheels, they would tend to be 280s, wouldn't they? But yeah, quite an old-fashioned design, which is quite cool. And then finally, now this one, I'm throwing in here because I think I would get comments about it if I didn't. Now, this is Stephenson's Rocket. It's the oldest of them all, and I think I would get loads of comments saying, "Ooh, you've missed Stephenson's Rocket if I didn't include it." Well, of course, you might not realise it, but Stephenson's Rocket is not a Victorian loco. In fact, it predates the Victorian era quite considerably. I think it was built several years before Queen Victoria got onto the throne. So it's a very, very early steam loco. Well, I didn't really realise this, but it was actually from before the Victorian times. So I'm including it, so don't send me comments saying I've forgotten it, but it's not a Victorian loco, so that's all you're going to see of it. Okay, well, there we go. Those are my Victorian tender locos. Not an awful lot of them this time. I think we've had more in other running sessions, but still I think enough to make a decent video. So I hope you like seeing those. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to choose just 6 of them and we're going to do a bit of a running session with them. So I'm going to set up some trains and I'll be back with you in just a second and we'll get some running, shall we? Alright, so here comes the first loco now, and yes, it's one that generally speaking I can't resist. It is of course the Drummond T9, and yes, quite obviously I've also gone for the lovely southern green version just because I love that so much. So these actually originated from the LSWR, so that was the railway that they came from back in the Victorian period, and they were designed by Dougall Drummond and it was introduced in 1899, so basically at the tail end there of the Victorian era. They were intended for express passenger work and 66 were built over about 3 years. These locos served for many years and they were eventually incorporated into the Southern Railway in 1923, where they continued in service until their withdrawal took place. Some of the class received an overhaul during the Second World War, and those that were painted into wartime black, and sadly only one of them has been preserved. It's number 120 and it's preserved at the NRM, and sadly the rest were scrapped. So there we go. Don't you reckon that one's a beauty? And I don't think I've ever tried my super detailed southern coaches with this before, so yeah, that's quite a nice first for me. But there we go, working very nicely. So I'll leave her, well, I'll bring her to a stop or perhaps leave her running. Yeah, I'll leave her running and I'll show you what's next. Alright, so here's the second engine, once again one that I've not run for quite a while. So this is of course the Dean Goods, also known as the Great Western 2301 class, and they were introduced in 1883, so well in the Victorian times, to the design of William Dean for goods work on the Great Western Railway. The class was produced for over 15 years and in that time 260 were built, which is quite a massive number really for the age. The class served for several years and even several of them were sent to France during the First World War, and some even ended up as far afield as Salonika. 54 of the class survived until 1948 when they were eventually acquired by British Railways, and as time went by they were eventually replaced by the standard Class 2s. The last was withdrawn in 1957, being 60 years old. Only one of the class has been preserved and the remainder were sadly scrapped. So there's another beauty for you, running very well actually. I often wonder whether this one's working right or not. It often runs a bit slow and smells a bit, but absolutely fine today, so that's brilliant. Okay, well, let's get the third engine out then. In fact, I'll put the camera down on the ground because it should be coming any second. Okay, so here's loco number 3 then. It's probably the largest I've shown today. It is of course the G2A, and the G2A were one of many powerful classes of 080 locomotives designed for the LNWR, and they were a development of the earlier G1 class which were built around the turn of the 20th century. Now it might well be that this G2A wasn't built in the Victorian times, but the design definitely dates back to that era, which is why I've included it, although, you know, be aware that it's a little bit dubious really. So the class was designed by Charles Bowen Cooke and 327 examples existed in total, all of which were rebuilt from the original G1 design. The class survived for many years and 320 in fact survived well into the BR era, which is the vast majority of the original class. Sadly none of the G2As were preserved, but one G2 has been, which is very similar looking but technically not identical of course. So there you have it then, 3 very fine Victorian steam locomotives, and I love them all, I really do. So stay tuned because I'm going to be running another 3 in just a second, but first of all we'll have a quick run with these, shall we, and just get some nice shots of them if at all possible. I think it is the T9 that's stealing the show for me so far though. Really do love that one. Yes, and the Dean Goods. In fact, all 3 of these are lovely, aren't they? I would say these are 3 of my favourites, actually. Oh, Out of focus Dean Goods, I apologise. Yeah, it just looks lovely, that one, doesn't it? No matter what you think of the model, it's just something about it looks fabulous. Very nice. Okay, very nice. Well, I hope you enjoyed those first three. I've still got the pleasant job to choose three more, so I'll do that and get some trains sorted for them as well, and I'll be right back in just a second when that's all done. So stay tuned and I'll be back with you in just a second. Ah, that Dean Goods has stopped again. Ugh. So you might be able to hear this next one already because it does have TTS sound. It is of course the J36, and I might have run this a few times already over the last few months, but genuinely I can't help it. So the J36 started life way back in 1888 when it was first introduced onto the North British Railway to the design of Matthew Holmes. In the NBR days, before grouping, the class was known as the NBR-C class, obviously not the same as the SECR-C class. 200 were produced in total between 1888 and 1901, so basically all of them in the Victorian era, and the final 32 were rebuilt from Drummond J32 locomotives. The class was primarily intended for freight work, and it featured 18-inch inside cylinders with Stephenson valve gear also hidden between the frames. 123 examples survived long enough to enter BR ownership, although by 1967 the final two members of the class were withdrawn and scrapped with no survivors, and after this no more steam locomotives remained in service in Scotland. So I truly never get bored of seeing this J36 running. It just is a superb model. I think it's the livery as well. I just can't seem to get enough of it, really. It's just one of those that really just does it for you. So that's awesome, and I'll leave her running, and while I do, I will get the next few engines out. Might turn the sound off as well though. So you can't do a Victorian tender running session without this engine because it really is very impressive indeed. So this is a unique locomotive built in 1886 by Nielsen and Company for the Caledonian Railway, and it was known as the Caledonian Single Wheeler, or Caledonian 123. So obviously you can see it has this single set of driving wheels which were absolutely huge at 7 feet I think in diameter, making her capable of almost 60 miles per hour. And in the 1880s that was supposedly quite impressive, and I assume quite scary as well when they were sort of used to horse-drawn equipment in those days. So it was eventually absorbed into the LMS, as we saw earlier with the LMS Crimson version in 1923, where she served as a 1P passenger loco in LMS Maroon. Must have been quite a special thing to see because obviously it still was one of a kind. It was eventually retired from service in the 1970s, and it's now living in a museum at Glasgow Riverside. So yes, a very speedy one, this one, and of course today she's hauling a little bit of a goods train, although obviously bear in mind in real life this was more or less just for passenger work, but I've just done that because otherwise I end up just running those same old coaches, those Caledonian coaches that I always run, so I thought I'd have a bit of a change. Okay, one more engine still to show. It's one of my old favourites once again, so let's get to it. So here we go then, finally. As you can see, we are finishing off as we started with a loco from the Southern Railway, or rather the SECR, but this one is in the Southern livery as you can see. So it is the C-Class. It was designed by Harry Wainwright and introduced to the SECR, the South Eastern and Chatham Railway, in 1900. And these were mainly intended for freight, but they were occasionally used for passenger duties as well. The final batch of engines were even kitted out with heating equipment to really make the most of its passenger capabilities. In 1923, the class became part of the Southern Railway, as so many of these old classes did, and they performed mainly passenger duties there as well, having been fitted with that carriage heating equipment specifically for the job. 109 were produced in total between 1900 and 1908, but sadly only one was preserved. The first withdrawal took place in 1947 as a result of poor maintenance, but the remainder of the class survived until 1953 when further withdrawals were made. So this class is only just a Victorian class really. Only a few of them were built actually during the Victorian era, but what we can say is that at least the design originates from the Victorian era. So there you have it then folks, a video all about Victorian tender engines. Let me know which you prefer, tender engines or tank engines, or do you have no preference at all? Whatever the case may be, do let me know, and I'll be interested to see which one comes out on top. I'll put up a poll. And yeah, I think I will let you have a minute or two just watching these run. Blimey, that Caledonian's quick, isn't she? I have talked about this before, but the problem is she will run nice and slowly, and in fact I'll do that for you in just a second. But then the trouble is she stops on points. But I will just show you the slow speed. And as if by magic, the Caledonian is now in the shot. There we go, that might be my first ever Sam's Trains magic trick. Anyway, so let's just demonstrate then that this can do a nice crawl since I've gone and said it now, so. I mean, it ain't quiet, and it's not smooth, but as you can see, that wheel can spin pretty slowly. It doesn't have to go super fast. And yes, I know, if I was reviewing this, I would say that was about the worst slow speed we've ever seen. But don't forget, this comes back from the 1960s, I think. So this is certainly not bad for the age, I don't think. Right, off you go, take it away, just to show you can do it. But yes, that was a lot of fun. I did enjoy that one. Victorian steam locos, definitely one of my favourite subjects, I would say. So if you don't mind being bombarded by yet another poll, I will just put up a poll to so that you can let me know, rather, which of the engines I've run has been your favourite. For me, I think it's going to have to be the J36 now. Yeah, lots of lovely ones, but that one wins it for me. So, for the time being, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Hopefully you did. And, yep, I'll be back with you again pretty soon with something a little different. So, I'll talk to you again very soon, folks. Have a great day, have a great week, and I'll see you next time. Cheers, everybody.